The valley had not changed its shape, but it had changed its soul. When she rode in at dawn, the land greeted her the way it always had, low fog clinging to the riverbanks, cottonwood leaves whispering in the morning breeze, red dust rising softly beneath the hooves of her horse. The mountains still stood like old guardians, dark against the pale sky. Yet something felt different. Time had passed here in silence, carving its mark not only into the earth, but into the people who remained. She had not planned to return. Life beyond the valley had pulled her far away into towns that grew fast and forgot faster. But memory has a way of calling a person home, especially when unfinished moments linger like shadows at the edge of the mind. This valley held such a moment for her, one that had never been spoken aloud. Only felt as she passed the old trading post, now half collapsed and abandoned. She remembered the sound of voices once raised in trade and laughter. Back then, the valley had been a place of meeting where cultures brushed against each other cautiously but often peacefully. Now the silence felt heavier. Doors stayed shut longer. People watched first and spoke later. The West had taught them to survive, but not always to trust. Word of her return traveled quickly, as it always did in places where nothing much happened anymore. Heads turned. Eyes followed her path. Some faces recognized her. Others only sensed that she did not belong to the present, but to the past. No one stopped her. No one needed to. The valley itself was asking the questions. She rode toward the river, where the land opened wide and the sky felt endless. That was where she first sensed him, not by sight, but by memory. Stories whispered in low voices had followed her even before she arrived. There was an Apache man living in the hills. They said, quiet, watchful, strong. A man who spoke little of his past and nothing at all of his childhood. Some claimed he carried old pain. Others said he simply preferred the company of the land. She knew better. As a child, she had known him before he became a figure of rumor. Back then, he had been a boy with sharp eyes and careful words, taught early that silence could be a form of protection. The valley had not been kind to him then. It had been a place of lessons learned too soon and trust broken too early. She had never forgotten the look on his face the day everything changed, when words should have been spoken but weren't. The valley remembered that day too. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of sage and water. Her horse slowed, sensing her unease. Somewhere beyond the trees and stone, he was there, still, watching. The land had shaped him just as it had shaped her, but in different ways. For him, survival had meant endurance. For her, it had meant leaving. This return was not about reclaiming the past. It was about facing it. The West had always taught hard lessons about patience, about restraint, about knowing when to act and when to wait. Yet it also taught that land holds stories longer than people do. Every trail, every scarred tree, every bend in the river remembered what human voices tried to forget. She dismounted near the water and let her horse drink. The surface of the river reflected the sky, calm but deep, much like the valley itself. She understood then that her arrival was not an accident. The silence she felt was not emptiness. It was expectation. Somewhere in this valley lived a truth that had waited since childhood to be spoken. Not loudly, not in anger, but honestly. As the sun climbed higher, warming the dust and stone, she took her first step back into the life she had once left behind. The valley, patient as ever, waited for what would finally be said. The man in the hills was known to all, yet known to none. To the settlers, he was a figure of mystery, a man of few words and many actions. To the children, he was a shadow among the pines, a story whispered by firesides. To the Apache elders, he was a living lesson, silent, watchful, and unshakably proud. He had grown up here, under the endless sky and the rugged hills, learning early that words could be as dangerous as bullets. As a boy, he had watched the consequences of careless speech unfold: family quarrels, misunderstandings, even tragedy. From that day, he carried a vow in his heart. Some truths were too heavy for the tongue. Some feelings were safer hidden. Yet in the quiet of his cabin, surrounded by the scent of cedar and the soft murmur of the river, he thought often of her. He recognized her the instant she rode into the valley, not by memory alone, but by instinct. Years had passed, and yet the shape of her presence, the light in her eyes, had not faded. His lips, trained to remain sealed, tightened slightly at the sight. Emotions that had lain dormant for decades stirred, but he forced them down. He had learned survival in silence. The valley had taught him patience, but not all lessons were easy to bear. Every interaction with outsiders reminded him of the fragility of trust. Yet when she appeared, he felt a strange tug in his chest, a memory of laughter, shared secrets, and moments too fleeting to ever truly vanish. She was the one person who had glimpsed the boy he once was, before life demanded he bury his words. Days passed, and he observed her from a distance. He watched as she revisited old places, the riverbank where they had once played, the ridge where the wind had carried their voices, the trading post where she had learned the value of both commerce and conversation. He noticed the careful way she moved, how she treated the land and its creatures with respect. It was a subtle grace, one he had always admired but never mentioned. Still, he remained silent. It was not stubbornness or pride, it was habit. It was caution. Every syllable had to be weighed, every confession measured. The boy who had once feared the consequences of spoken words still lived within him, and he could not yet risk letting her see the weight he carried. But the valley, patient as ever, seemed to sense the tension. Even the river, flowing steadily past rock and root, seemed to murmur at him as though urging him to speak. The hills, the wind, the birds, they were witnesses to a story held for too long. Waiting for the right moment, when she finally noticed him watching from the ridge, her expression was calm, almost knowing. She did not approach recklessly. She did not speak immediately. She understood, perhaps instinctively, that some silences were not emptiness, they were preparation. She waited, as the valley waited, for the boy within him to step forward. To reconcile the past with the present. In that quiet, he realized something crucial. Words, once hidden, could be powerful. They could heal not just wounds, but generations of fear and misunderstanding. And perhaps, finally, the time had come for the silence to end. The Apache of the hills remained watchful, his posture unwavering, but a small shift had occurred inside him. Something long buried had stirred. And though he did not yet speak, the first step had been taken: acknowledgement of the past, and recognition that the valley and she were part of the life he could no longer keep at arm's length. The valley had a way of remembering everything. Every footfall, every shouted word, every laugh and tear lingered in its hills and rivers like invisible echoes that refused to fade. As she moved through the familiar trails, the memories pressed upon her, some sweet, some painful, all impossibly alive. And somewhere in those memories lay the man who had haunted her thoughts for years. When they crossed paths again, it was by the river where the water ran deep and clear, cutting its way through the red earth like a silver ribbon. He was there first, standing tall against the slope of the hill, eyes scanning the horizon, alert to any disturbance. His presence was quiet but commanding, like a mountain that watches storms pass but never bends. She noticed the subtle shift in his posture, the tension in his shoulders, the way his gaze softened, just for a moment when it met hers. For both of them, the valley held unfinished business. Childhood memories returned in flashes. The boy he had been, daring yet cautious, always measured. The girl she had been, full of curiosity and fearless questions. They remembered the day that had changed everything, the fight over words spoken too quickly, the misunderstanding that had driven a wedge between their families, and the moment when trust had been broken for the first time. He had learned early that words carry weight beyond understanding. One careless word had cost him a piece of his childhood. And from that day, he kept a vow: speak only when necessary, reveal only when safe. Silence became his armor, and the valley became his sanctuary. But now, seeing her again, he felt the old fissure stir. The buried emotions demanding attention. She, too, had grown, though in different ways. Her return to the valley was not only a journey of memory, but a confrontation with the past. She had learned patience in distant towns, the value of listening, and the courage to face uncomfortable truths. She had returned not to accuse, not to reopen old wounds, but to acknowledge them, to see if healing was possible. Their conversations were cautious at first, little more than nods and polite distance. Words were measured, carefully chosen. Yet each glance, each shared silence, carried meaning deeper than any spoken sentence. He had always known that the heart remembers more than the tongue, and she understood that some stories are best revealed slowly, piece by piece. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the western hills, painting the valley in shades of gold and crimson, she finally spoke of the past. Not in accusation, not in anger, but with a quiet, steady voice that carried warmth and understanding. She told him what she had carried all these years, her regrets, her memories, and her lingering hope that some part of their shared past could be redeemed. For the first time in decades, he felt the weight of silence pressing against him in a different way. The boy who had feared speaking now wrestled with the man he had become, the one who knew the power of words and the value of truth. Every childhood fear, every lesson in restraint, now clashed with a growing awareness. Some words, spoken at the right time, could free both him and the valley itself. As night fell and stars emerged over the hills, the tension between them did not vanish, but it softened. The unspoken truths hovered like fireflies in the air, small, fragile, and luminous, waiting for the courage to land in the open. Both understood that the next step, the moment of honesty, was inevitable. The valley, silent and watchful, seemed to hold its breath, as if anticipating the day when the man who had hidden words since childhood would finally speak. And though neither of them knew exactly when that moment would come, they both felt the stirrings of something new: hope, the possibility of understanding, and the first glimmer of a future where the past no longer bound them in silence. The valley was never still for long. Its quiet moments were always followed by trial storms, wildfires, or men and women testing its boundaries. And now, just as she had returned, a new challenge arrived. Outsiders had come to stake claims on the land, bringing threats of greed and conflict. The settlers worried for their homes, the Apache watched for trespassers, and the valley itself seemed to bristle under the tension. He had lived here all his life, knowing the ways of the hills and the rivers, understanding the language of the wind and the warning of the coyote's howl. But this test was unlike any before. For the first time, he would need more than silent observation. He would need leadership, courage, and the trust of someone he had not spoken to in decades. She, too, was tested. Her return had been quiet, almost tentative, but now she was drawn into the unfolding conflict. She saw the danger clearly and knew the valley could not endure without cooperation. Their paths converged at the riverbank, where the tension between settler and Apache was at its peak. "You know this land better than anyone," she said softly, stepping close. "We can't let it be taken. Not by fear, not by greed. You have to lead." His jaw tightened. Leadership had always been a burden he bore quietly, but this was different. He had avoided confrontation, avoided words that might inflame the past. But she was right. The valley needed more than endurance, it needed action. And for that, silence would no longer suffice. The test was immediate. Cattle had wandered onto disputed land. A settler claimed theft. Old grudges simmered beneath the surface. He had to negotiate, to assert boundaries, and to protect lives. And in every decision, he felt her presence beside him, reminding him that cooperation and courage often require vulnerability. As the days passed, he realized that the valley was teaching him a new lesson. The past could not hold him hostage. Childhood fears, old silence, and unspoken words were all part of his story, but they did not define the man he had become. He could act boldly and still honor his roots. He could speak and protect not just with hands and weapons, but with words. She watched him closely, noticing the shift. His movements were deliberate, his decisions thoughtful, and when he spoke, it was with clarity and respect. The boy who had once feared words was transforming into the man who could use them wisely. And slowly, as he took the lead, the settlers began to listen. The Apache community began to trust. And the valley, ever patient, seemed to settle. Sensing the return of balance. By the end of the week, the immediate threats had been managed. The outsiders left or adapted to the rules of the land. The settlers had gained a new respect for the man in the hills, the Apache who had always been part of the valley's story but had remained unseen. And he, in turn, began to see that his silence, though protective, could no longer shield him entirely. For the first time, he recognized the truth he had avoided since childhood. The valley could survive without fear, but only if he, and the people around him, faced the challenges honestly. And if he was willing, finally, to speak the words he had hidden for so long, it could heal not just himself, but the relationships and trust that had frayed over the years. The stage was set. The valley had tested them both, and they had endured. Now came the moment they had both sensed, deep in the hills and in their hearts, the moment when silence would give way to truth, when the boy and the man could reconcile, and when the words long held would finally be spoken. The sun was dipping low over the western hills, painting the valley in golden and crimson light. Shadows stretched across the red dirt, long and deliberate, as if the land itself were leaning in to witness what was about to happen. He had been silent for decades, holding words in his chest that had been forged in childhood fears, tempered by pride, and hidden beneath years of restraint. But now, with her near, the weight of those words pressed too heavily to ignore. They stood at the edge of the river, where the water ran clear over smooth stones, reflecting the last light of day. She did not speak immediately. She understood that some truths could not be rushed, that the courage to speak must come from within. The valley seemed to echo the stillness between them, listening. He drew a slow breath, feeling the familiar tension in his shoulders, the boyish fear of consequences, and the man's resolve that had grown stronger over the years. His voice, when it came, was quiet but firm, careful, deliberate, but filled with honesty. "I should have spoken long ago," he began, his eyes on the flowing river. "There were things I feared. Things I thought would bring harm if I said them. Words I kept hidden, not because I did not care, but because I was afraid of losing more than I already had." She listened, her gaze steady, her hands relaxed at her sides. She knew him too well to interrupt, too well to question. This was his moment, and it was his to claim. "I have carried these words since I was a boy," he continued. "I wanted to tell you then that your friendship mattered more than I could ever say, that your trust, your courage, helped me survive the things I could not face alone. And I am sorry for the silence, for the years lost, for the walls I built around my heart. For a heartbeat, there was only the sound of the river and the distant cry of a hawk." Then she stepped closer, just enough to close the space that had always existed between them. "You were never truly silent," she said softly. "I could always see it, in your eyes, in your actions." The valley remembered too. It's not the words that heal, it's the courage to finally say them. He looked at her then. Really looked, seeing not only the woman she had become, but the girl who had once ridden beside him, laughed with him, and shared the world he had feared to speak of. In that moment, years of hesitation melted away. The valley seemed to exhale, the wind lifting in the cottonwoods as if in approval. "I care for you," he said finally, the simplest of words carrying the heaviest of meanings. "I always have." She smiled, warmth and relief lighting her face. "And I for you," she replied. "I waited, because I knew you would speak when it mattered most." The words, once imprisoned in his heart, now flowed freely, joining the river, the wind, and the valley itself. They were simple, but they were enough. Enough to heal old wounds. Enough to reconnect two lives that had been intertwined from childhood. Enough to remind them that silence, while protective, could never replace truth. The Apache's confession did not erase the past, but it transformed it. Pain and misunderstanding were replaced by recognition, respect, and the possibility of a shared future. The valley, ever patient, seemed to glow in the fading light, welcoming the reconciliation. That evening, as the first stars appeared over the hills, they sat together by the river, letting the quiet speak its own truth. The words had been said, the burdens had been lightened, and for the first time in decades, both felt the valley not as a place of memories to endure, but as a home where the heart could finally rest. The valley had changed once again, but this time it was a change of hope, not loss. The sun rose slowly over the western hills, spilling light across the red dust and green cottonwoods, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch toward the future. The river shimmered in the morning glow, carrying away old sorrows and leaving a sense of renewal in its wake. He walked beside her through the familiar trails, not as the silent boy of the past, nor merely as the watchful man of the hills, but as someone who had finally found his voice. The words he had kept hidden since childhood had been spoken, and with them came freedom, not only for him, but for the valley and for her. Life in the valley was never easy. Challenges came, as they always did, from harsh winters, wildfires, or the unpredictable whims of settlers and nature alike. But now, there was trust and understanding where there had once been fear and silence. The Apache and the settlers, once distant and cautious, began to see the strength in working together. He became a bridge between worlds, guiding with wisdom learned from the land, from the lessons of his childhood, and from the courage to finally speak. She chose to stay, not just because of him, but because the valley itself called to her. Together, they rebuilt what had been lost, old fences repaired. The trading post reopened, and small gatherings of settlers and Apache families held along the riverbank, where stories, laughter, and music filled the air once more. The valley, patient and enduring, had witnessed the return of balance, and it seemed to respond with quiet celebration. Their relationship, grounded in shared history and the lessons of patience, honesty, and courage, grew steadily. She taught the children of the valley about the land, its plants, its animals, and the wisdom of listening. He shared the skills of survival, respect for the earth, and the importance of measured words. The past was never forgotten, but it no longer controlled them. Instead, it became a teacher, a guide to living fully in the present. One evening, as they sat on the ridge overlooking the valley, he spoke again, not with the weight of fear, but with calm certainty. "This valley," he said, "has taught me that strength is not just survival. Strength is knowing when to speak, when to listen, and when to trust." She nodded, her hand brushing his. "And it has taught me that coming home is not about the place itself, but about facing what we carry inside and sharing it with those who understand. The wind carried their words across the valley, rustling the cottonwoods and lifting the scent of sage and dust. The stars appeared overhead, mirrored in the river below, as if the heavens themselves witnessed the renewal of the land and the hearts within it. The Apache and the woman from the valley had learned the most important lesson of all, that words, courage, and understanding could heal old wounds, bridge differences, and create a future brighter than any past could shadow. They were no longer bound by fear or silence, but freed by honesty and trust. As the first light of the new year glimmered across the hills, the valley was alive with promise. Children laughed, settlers worked side by side with Apache neighbors, and the river continued to flow endlessly, patiently, faithfully. And in that enduring rhythm, two hearts once separated by time and fear finally found a home. The valley had waited long for this day. And now, with words spoken, wounds healed, and courage embraced, a new beginning had arrived in the Old West, one of hope, learning, and happiness.